You're listening to 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, the flagship academic publication of Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. On 37th in the World, we dive into crucial global trends and speak directly with experts working on issues ranging from security to the economy, technology to society, and more. In today's episode, we dive into the implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America with Dr. Margaret Myers. Aside from serving as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, Dr. Myers is the managing director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, a senior advisor for Inter-American Dialogue, and a former analyst at the U.S. Department of Defense. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To begin, could you please speak on some of the primary motivations for China and states in Latin America to engage in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Sure. China's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean has in many ways predated the Belt and Road Initiative even, right? It started in a really earnest fashion around the 1990s and has really grown in intensity ever since then. And in many ways, this is a relationship where the motivating factors are continuous, right, throughout this entire period. Even back in the 1990s, we saw so many of the same drivers of Chinese engagement in the region that we see today. Many of them are linked to something called the going out strategy. And that had three tenets. One of them was market-seeking activity, looking for markets for China's wide-ranging and growing exports then and now. Certainly, resource-seeking activity is a very big part of this calculation as well, and was then as China sought out oil from many countries in the region, Venezuela chief among them, as it sought out minerals. An investment in copper in Peru was among the first investments that China undertook in Latin America during this enhanced period of engagement. And also agricultural goods, right, have been a really big part of this story overall. And then the third thing that the going out strategy sort of promoted was internationalization of Chinese companies. First, helping them to establish a presence, right, but then also making them competitive in markets even where they hadn't traditionally had much of a solid footing. And they did that at that moment in time by issuing credit, often at the national level, right, through sovereign loans, to be able to allow Chinese companies as part of those loan agreements to do construction and other work on the ground and to begin to establish a presence and a reputation for themselves. So much of this is still driving what China wants to do these days, right? Resources. We're still talking about this. This is a major driver of what's happening in the region, and even more resources are of interest now than were before, especially if we're talking about lithium, rare earths. This is a very big and growing part of the story. Even gold is growing in interest given its technological applications and also its use in terms of hedging against the dollar, which is something that many nations have been pursuing. And then, of course, markets. And markets, I think, now more than ever, Latin American markets, that is, are fundamental for China. China, as we all know, has massive excess capacity problems, not just in high tech and not just in these, they call them, the three main industries, batteries, electric vehicles, and solar, but also in other areas as well. Steel is one of these and has been for many, many years. That's been a long story in China. And other lower-end production is also something that China is looking to offload on external markets, and increasingly Latin America, and not just Latin America, but other parts of the world, right, are the recipients of so much of this exportation. Then if we're talking about making Chinese companies competitive, well, they already are. But there are still efforts to ensure that the right industries are incentivized to be able to invest in the types of projects that China deems most aligned with growth strategy and all of the many strategies outlined in the 15th Five-Year Plan.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, to what extent do Latin American states have leeway to negotiate the terms of their BRI participation?
The BRI is an interesting and evolving concept. It was something that was developed 2013, as we know. It's over a decade old now. Its original manifestation was a little bit different than what we are seeing now, and indeed it's ever changing. So, it began as something more regional, more Silk Road adjacent, and has become over time global. Latin America was the very last region to be included as of 2018 officially, even though Panama joined in 2017. it became global over that period of time. But the focus of the Belt and Road Initiative has also shifted somewhat in recent years, in part because it's essentially a mechanism through which to carry out Chinese foreign policy, but also to carry out, the various domestic economic policies that China is putting forth and advancing in various forms, including industrial policy and strategy. And there's a real connection between what happens at home, right, and what happens overseas. What we saw, I think, around 2015, 2016 was a massive focus on infrastructure development. For many countries, including in Latin America, BRI is synonymous with infrastructure development. That's not necessarily the case anymore, but it certainly was at the height of this BRI lending for these purposes. 2015, 2016, we saw an explosion of announcements of large-scale projects, some of which materialized, some of which didn't. We saw massive efforts to finance this through Chinese policy banks, China Development Bank, China Export Bank, and others, commercial banks too. Now we are in a totally new phase. I mean, at this moment, we're not seeing the focus on big infrastructure in the way that we have in the past. We're seeing a real shift. Less overall capital is being directed to the region, but we're seeing more projects, albeit sort of funneled into these industries that China deems most critically linked to its own economic growth prospects. This is an imperative for China as it looks to achieve even moderate rates of economic growth in the next few years. Chancai is something that we all reference, the port in Peru, but that was negotiated quite a few years ago, in fact, during this previous phase, when big infrastructure was a very big part of the story. Now the story might be one of using that port facility to build out adjacent infrastructure that is supporting of new and emerging industries, right? Many of which China is looking to have a critical presence in, and in some cases be a dominant player. So how much control do countries have? Well, they can choose whether to join on to the Belt and Road Initiative or not. Essentially, all that means is signing a memorandum of understanding, a non-binding memorandum of understanding that suggests that there will be enhanced activity, more in the way of collaboration and cooperation under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative, and is demonstrative of a country's support for China's vision of its foreign policy and foreign outreach and economic diplomacy. In general, countries have perceived very little risk in signing on to the BRI, aside from those U.S. allies that deemed this to be potentially problematic in terms of signaling to the United States. But most have signed on at this juncture, and whether that has meant anything in the way of massive infusion of capital, right, is another critical question. And in some cases, yes, signing on to the BRI, in addition to doing other things like cutting ties with Taiwan, has resulted in a series of projects, big and small. In other cases, not a whole lot has happened. And so it really does depend on which country, on when things happen, and what are the various factors that are shaping the environment and the bilateral dynamic at any given juncture. Countries are also able to leave the BRI. There's a 5 years memorandum of understanding, and at the end of that 5 years, there's the prospect of leaving. In Honduras now, there's a discussion among some candidates about possibly doing that. Panama has talked about the same, right, just at a moment when Colombia has joined. And so there's a bit of flux in the region at the moment, some thinking about what BRI participation means, what it means both in practical terms and in symbolic terms.
Could you expand on how the BRI has challenged U.S. influence in Latin America?
To understand that, we have to understand really what the Belt and Road Initiative entails. Sort of narrow interpretation of the Belt and Road Initiative, both in the U.S., potentially globally, certainly in the Latin American context, right, in terms of equating the BRI with large-scale infrastructure investment or just investment in general. And that's certainly a big part of it, but if we go back to around 2015, there was an interesting white paper that was published that sought to sort of define the Belt and Road Initiative as it was understood at that particular juncture. And I think that this particular definition, even though it's about a decade old, still resonates. What do I mean by that? Well, it described 5 areas of focus in the BRI. One of these is infrastructure connectivity. And we all know about this, and certainly there's been road and rail and dredging projects and bridges and, airports and ports and all of the things that we hear about frequently in the media. And some of those happen, some of them don't. It's important to keep track of that, right, and not have an overestimation in mind. Another is trade cooperation, trade linkages. But what we're talking about is building connectivity in various forms. So there's infrastructure, obviously, that's clear. Trade connectivity can be established and enhanced in many ways, right? Trade agreements are a part of this, opening markets through investment that's targeting cultivation of goods or mining. All of this facilitates trade. Another way that the BRI intends to sort of carry out its objectives is through financial integration. What does that mean? That can mean through lending arrangements. It can be through renminbi internationalization projects, right? Doing deals or denominating loans and transactions in renminbi rather than in local currency or in US dollars. There have been currency swap arrangements, but all kinds of financial transactions, new financial platforms that China is using to create linkages and also to facilitate commercial activity. All of this is happening. Then there are two others that we really need to understand very well. One is policy coordination, and policy coordination can mean a lot of things. It can mean talking about policies related to investment, for instance, to try and see if there aren't new opportunities that can be created for Chinese companies to enter certain sectors. There is policy coordination at higher levels within multilateral organizations. So, for instance, on questions related to internet governance or sovereignty, on questions related to human rights, on these definitional issues, on standard setting. All of this is policy coordination in some form or another, and is quite fundamental to the way that China has been doing things in the region. And then the fifth, and this is often overlooked, is people-to-people connectivity. And this is where, if I had to say China is really focusing more effort, it's in this area. It's in public diplomacy. It's in getting people on the ground, establishing networks, making sure that there are contacts and wide-ranging administrative levels that are needed for Chinese companies and for others to understand the challenge that China poses and the influence that China has managed to develop over time. One needs to understand how that is expressed across all of these domains and how collectively we ought to interpret China's current position. Trade, especially, cannot be overlooked, right? Of all of these, if we are thinking about what motivates decision makers in different countries, trade connectivity is fundamental in these equations. If you are exporting 90% of your top commodities to one market, then that's obviously going to affect dramatically the range of decisions that you are willing to take. Trade is fundamentally important, but so are all of these networks, and so are all of these networks that are increasingly not just at the national level, right, but are being developed at the provincial, state, and municipal levels, which are enormously effective in advancing wide-ranging objectives, especially on the commercial side.
And I'm wondering, how does China's engagement in Latin America differ from the approach taken by the United States?
It's been dramatically different. I think it's different both in terms of the sectors that China has sought to engage with. We see really different priorities, many of them related to trade complementarity. China needs Latin American commodities to include agricultural commodities in a way that the U.S. does not, at least not to the same degree. Certainly minerals and metals, especially critical minerals and metals, have grown in interest to the United States, especially at this moment in which it finds itself in a difficult negotiating position with China, which controls so much of that supply, not only the minerals, but the entire supply chain. There are areas of overlap. There are areas of difference in terms of the trade-related interests. Same goes with investment. There are sectors where China is investing very heavily, many of them related to these traditional sectors of interest, oil and gas, coal in some instances, other mining projects, agricultural investment, hard infrastructure, right? Some of these overlap with U.S. interests, some of them do not. As it stands, the U.S., in terms of investment stock, has a much more profound position, but China's flows are contributing over time, right, to more and more investment, especially in strategic assets across the region. Another thing that we see that China does in the investment space is to invest very heavily in specific industries to the point where China may be the only investor in certain strategic industries. This is the case in a number of cities in Peru and Brazil, for instance, wherein China is the sole owner, or Chinese companies collectively are the sole owners of that infrastructure and of broader generation, distribution, transmission capabilities. I think there is a perception at this juncture among many in Latin America, in part because of the massive informational campaign that China is waging in Latin America, that it is inclined to be more helpful to the region from a developmental perspective than perhaps other traditional partners. This is a message that China has sought to convey for decades, and this message, I think, has grown in traction over time, in part in response to, U.S. policy, in other cases because Chinese messaging capabilities are more sophisticated now than they have been in the past, and China is very good at framing things in a way that really do resonate.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Myers, for meeting with me today to discuss the implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. China's recent BRI activity follows a pattern, starting in the 1990s, of economic engagement in the region. Overall, Latin American states see little risk in signing a memorandum of understanding and joining the BRI. China has focused its recent efforts on gaining influence, particularly through trade and person-to-person connections. This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast description that says "Support the Show." To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out gajia.georgetown.edu.
This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast's description that says "Support the Show." To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out gajia.georgetown.edu.